I suppose we all desire most the things we do not possess. In Penny and my case, this has been particularly true. My wife is quite short, with a rounded figure, not by any means fat, and blonde hair. In contrast, Penny is tall and angular with dark hair. And I feel strongly attracted to both of them. Similarly, Penny's husband is short whereas I am very tall. His skin is tanned while mine is paler. For a full 10 years our two families got on well together, kids about the same age, interests similar. It's true that, when I sat next to Penny at dinner parties, the conversation often took on a friend nature, until one New Year party when I realized that, gradually but undeniably, something had significantly changed. Looking back, I can now see how it began with small things, holding on to me just a fraction longer than she used to when kissing goodnight on the cheek, occasionally accidentally not turning her head far enough at the end of an evening so we kissed slightly on the lips by mistake. Nothing concrete, but in retrospect a frisson was definitely developing. Of course, I failed to spot this at the time. Gradually, when making arrangements for our families to meet, or to help with each other's kids, it became my mobile phone that Penny called or sent texts to rather than my wife's. Text conversations involved more than just one or two practical sentences. Penny's messages began to end with an X. Only small things again, but gradually they added up to a distinct change in the nature of my relationship with her. And because it happened slowly, it had become bedded in long before either of us realized it. It was only after one long, slightly drunken Friday night dinner party at the house of mutual friends that things suddenly changed in a way that even I couldn't miss. Penny seldom drinks, but that night she and her husband had been given a lift to the dinner by some other guests, so Penny was free to have a few glasses of wine. Amusingly, she gets giggly after only a couple of glasses and, predictably sitting next to me, she became a little tipsy quite early on. We had been discussing the holiday that our two families were planning to go on together in the summer. I had gathered together a bag of brochures and had shortlisted half a dozen to select from. Penny's husband always lets her choose their holidays, and my wife leaves the decisions to me, so it was normal and natural for the two of us to talk them over. I offered to give Penny the bag of brochures I had brought with me, together with my handwritten notes, so she could look them over and tell me what she thought. That was when things changed. Penny put her hand on mine and a slightly odd look came over her face. Her voice when she spoke was low and conspiratorial. "No," she said. "Bring them over on Monday after the kids have gone to school." I was silent for a minute. A little tipsy myself, I wasn't sure I had understood her correctly. "Monday morning?" I asked, testing the situation. "So Paul can see them too?" "Paul will have gone off with the kids," Penny whispered, a little drunkenly, a meaningful smile on her face. She squeezed my hand under the table and turned to chat to the friend on her other side. I sat back, bemused. The rest of the dinner passed off without event, but by the time we were all standing in the hallway saying our thank you and good nights, I was beginning to doubt whether there had been any message at all. The guests walked as an elongated group along the long driveway to our cars, the night dark and moonless around us. My wife turned as she opened the car door and Penny gave her a goodnight peck on the cheek. I shook hands with Paul, both of us slurring our words slightly. As Penny casually leaned towards me for the usual farewell kiss, I had decided that it had all been an illusion brought on by too much good wine. But then as I bent to kiss her goodnight, she turned her head, it had to be deliberately, and I found myself kissing her on the lips. She pulled away suddenly, smiling. "See you on Monday," he whispered. "Sleep well." I stood speechless until my wife's voice brought me to my senses. I sat in the car and she drove us home. Not surprisingly, I spent the rest of the weekend with a belly full of butterflies, unsure whether Penny had really invited me to be with her, and even less sure whether I should take up the invitation if there had been one. No, I wasn't unsure, I knew full well I shouldn't, but I equally knew I had to see if I had been right. I had never cheated on my wife before, despite a number of opportunities. Besides, I had always thought of Penny more like a sister than a friend. Suddenly, to my horror, I realized that this made the idea even more exciting. I spent an anxious Sunday and a restless Sunday. By the time I went to bed on Sunday night, I had convinced myself that it had all been a misunderstanding and that I wasn't interested in her anyway. By the time I woke in the morning, however, I knew I had to at least see if I had been right. So on Monday morning at 7:30 a.m., I parked my car just round the corner from Penny's house on a busy through road where it would not attract attention. I waited patiently, half listening to the news on the radio and watching the driveway until I saw the automatic wooden gates swing inwards, and her husband's car, full of children, leave for school. I had told my wife that I had an early appointment with a customer in Leeds and had left the house early myself. She had no reason to suspect. Early appointments happened on a weekly basis. I fired up the engine and quickly nipped through the open gates and up the long straight driveway to the front door. In the rear-view mirror, I saw the gates swing shut behind me. Drawing to a halt, I pulled on the hand brake and stepped nervously out of my car. I looked around carefully. The house seemed deserted as I took my plastic bag of brochures out of the back seat and looked up at the windows. The room I knew to be their master bedroom had its curtains drawn. Suddenly there was movement behind the drapes and I thought I saw a face. It disappeared just as suddenly. Nervously I adjusted my tie. I crossed to the red front door and knocked softly. There was no response. I knocked a little harder and thought I could just make out the sound of running feet inside the house. There was a fumbling at the door, it opened a few inches then stopped, held by the security chain. Through the gap, I could just make out Penny's face. She didn't smile. My heart sank. "Hi Penny," I stammered, trying vainly to keep a casual note in my voice. The door closed in my face. Oh God! I thought. Have I made a mistake? Did I misread her messages? But then I heard a rattling as the security chain was unfastened and the door slowly swung open. Penny stood inside, her eyes on mine. There was a strange look on her face which did not at first reassure me. "Is this a bad time?" I asked, giving us both the chance to back out, or for me to pretend I'd come for some other reason. Penny just grinned in an embarrassed manner. "Has that been deliberate?" Oh God! I thought, perhaps I was right. "Come in," she whispered and, with my belly alive with butterflies, I entered the hall. "I've brought those holiday brochures for you," I said nervously, my voice squeaking stupidly as she closed the front door behind me. "Thanks." Penny smiled. "Have you got time for a coffee?" "What am I doing here?" was all that Marty Hampton could think. This wasn't where she belonged. She was standing at a bar, ordering a drink, looking around her like she knew what she was doing. But Marty had no clue what she was doing and she knew it. It had seemed innocent enough to begin with. Marty was in town for a convention with the hosiery industry. She needed a break from the conference atmosphere and had decided to go for a walk. When she had seen the bar, conveniently located in the lobby of the hotel where the convention was, Marty decided a drink was in order. After all of the typical executives that she knew would do just that, hit the bar and order a drink. But Marty wasn't typical. She was a 37-year-old introvert with almost zero exposure to such practices. Avoiding looking back at the bartender, who Marty was sure could tell that she was faking it, Marty rolled her eyes at her own foolishness. She ordered her drink, quietly paid for it and headed toward a booth in the back. Yet the bartender kept staring at her, as though he knew exactly what she was up to. The booth Marty had chosen was situated in such a way that, although she would be secluded from prying eyes, she would still be able to look out at the crowd. Marty snorted in derision as she sat down, squeezing her body onto the bench. Sighing to herself, she thought, this booth was probably built here by someone with about the same amount of social energy that I have. As she studied the people milling about inside the bar, Marty mentally kicked herself, once again, for her intense introversion. She had spent far too many years cooped up in the hosiery mill, focused on the product and how to perfect it. Now, she was paying the price. Her father, who had always handled the personal interactions with clients and business partners, had decided to retire and take a cruise around the world with his new bride. A cruise around the world? Who really did such a thing? Obviously a 75-year-old man with a 72-year-old sweetheart. That all meant that, 6 months ago, Marty, who had been the technical backbone of the company for the past 15 years, was suddenly thrust into the role her father had occupied, her very extroverted, handsome father. But Marty was trying to make the best of it after all. She was good at what she did. But sometimes it was all she could do to keep from laughing in the faces of her so-called business associates who had no idea what a dropped stitch was compared to a cross-stitch. How could they compete with her for contracts? The world of textiles was her world, it was where she belonged. She knew knitting machines inside and out. But the real truth was that the others could compete with her because they had social skills. And Marty didn't. She didn't look the part and she didn't know the games. In fact, just in order to buy the drink in her hand, she had literally had to hide behind a fake tree, pretending to talk on her cell phone, until she heard someone at the bar place an order for a drink that looked interesting. She didn't even know what kind of drinks they served at bars. And she was determined not to order a Coke. So when the cute girl with the short skirt batted her eyes at the bartender and asked for a gin and tonic, Marty had decided to follow suit. And now Marty was hidden in a corner, sipping a drink that somehow tasted a lot like pine sap smelled. Why did people drink this stuff? Wrinkling her nose in distaste, Marty watched the people walking around, mixing and flirting throughout the bar. It was mid-afternoon so the bar wasn't too crowded. Marty watched the cute girl whose drink she had copied, twirl the straw in her glass as she laughed with an older man Marty had met at the convention. Marty wondered if the younger woman really found the man to be as exciting as she appeared. It was only a moment though before Marty saw the woman laugh just a bit too loudly and cut her eyes over to where a handsome young waiter was bent over, cleaning off a table. Ah, so it was his attention she was trying to catch. Marty laughed to herself, noting that the waiter was far more interested in the stain on his table than the cute blonde trying to get his attention. How Marty wished she could just pick up her glass and float around the room like that young woman, though. When Marty had a sudden vision of herself floating about, she suddenly burst out laughing. At least it would have been a laugh had it not been at that very same moment that she was taking a sip of her drink. As it was, the liquid went the wrong way up her nose and, within moments, Marty was snorting and coughing like she was dying. Grabbing at a napkin that seemed to appear out of nowhere, Marty finally managed to get her cough under control. She used the napkin to cover her mouth, wipe off her nose and absorb most of the remaining drink from her face. Realizing she was going to live, Marty momentarily wished she wouldn't. Feeling the heat in her cheeks, she knew that it wasn't just from the rush of alcohol into her nasal cavity, or the lack of oxygen during her coughing fit, she was feeling the flush of embarrassment at having drawn attention to herself. She was trying to hide, not cause a commotion. Lowering the napkin from her face, Marty looked up to see who had been kind enough to offer it to her. Although she would have preferred to have been left alone during her moment of potential asphyxiation, she knew the expectation was that she should thank the person who had come to her rescue. Standing in front of her, with his eyebrows quirked in obvious amusement, stood the bartender, the same one she had only moments ago refused to meet his eyes. "A bit stronger than you are used to?" he asked smugly. Catching herself just short of rolling her eyes again, Marty lowered her head to look at her half-empty glass and quietly said, yes. That's what was wrong all right. It wasn't that Marty was trying to be rude to the bartender. But the man was obviously trouble. Not only did he look like a Native American storybook character with his jet black hair and tan skin, but when you threw in the blue eyes and the body, well, he was more than Marty could stand to look at long. This whole scenario caught Marty by surprise. It wasn't that she didn't like men. She just didn't have much experience with men. She had been far more focused on the thread quality for the socks that had always come first in her life. Men were too complicated. So Marty always assumed an air of feigned boredom around men. Since college, she had never found any man who interested her anyway. Or maybe it would be more accurate to say that she had never found one who she thought might be interested in her. It was a well-established fact that men only liked petite with big eyes. And Marty wasn't petite, had never been called pretty, and her eyes, well, they were big enough, she supposed. But that wasn't enough to ever convince Marty to actually engage in a conversation with a man about anything other than her beloved socks. It was too difficult. Over time, her protective practice had become a part of who she was. Marty just chose to ignore men. It came as a shock to Marty though, when she realized that her attitude wasn't having the desired effect on this man. This bartender hadn't walked away. She was giving the man her best dismissive attitude. Other people went away when she ignored them. Why was he still standing there? Marty quickly raised her head to look the bartender in the face. But as soon as she did, she realized that it was obvious where she had just been staring. Her face flamed into color again. It was the sound of his laughter that made Marty open her eyes again. She felt like a schoolgirl staring at the first guy she had ever had a crush on. The man was simply beautiful and his laugh was perfect to her ears. "Well, Marty Hampton, can I interest you in a less toxic drink?" Confusion etched Marty's face. The man had called her by name. Questioningly, she said, "Do you know me?" Again the bartender laughed, only this time it was a quiet and intimate laugh. "Well, I did fill your drink order, ma'am. And you did put it on your credit card. Forgive me for taking the opportunity to scope out your name. But I just couldn't pass up the opportunity." "Opportunity for what?" Marty blurted out before she even thought about it. "Opportunity to know if your name fit you," the man answered. "Oh," was all Marty could muster as she found herself lost again in the bartender's blue eyes. Marty never knew how long she sat there staring at the man. She was startled out of her revelry by the sound of someone coughing discreetly. She raised her eyes to see the waiter from earlier standing at the end of the table. "Ty, I hate to bother you, but the orders are piling up," the young man said hesitantly. Marty watched as her bartender, when exactly had he become her bartender, she wondered, stood up and nodded in her direction. "If you need anything, just let me know, Marty Hampton." Then he walked away, following the waiter back toward the bar. "Well, you handled that like a pro." Marty chided herself. Face to face with the first man who ever yanked the carpet right out from under her, and she hadn't even said anything remotely sensible. "Great," she muttered. Deciding that she had just had about all the excitement she could handle, Marty pushed aside her drink and scooted out of the booth. "Well, remind me to never attempt this kind of little adventure again," she said out loud to no one in particular. Then she headed for the door. Realizing that she really needed the comfort of her secure world of socks and hosiery machines, Marty opened the door back into the convention hall. She had almost made it to her display area when she became aware of a conversation going on at her kiosk. Marty recognized the voice of one of her own salesmen. Then Mammoth Marty declared that all the products were sub-quality to Her Highness's expectations. I don't know what she expects. Just because she is suddenly sole owner of the entire corporation, she thinks she can use all that college learning of hers to talk down to us. Well, I tell you what, I for one won't do what she says. I will just stand up in her face and tell her. In all of Marty's days, she had known herself to be a lot of things. She knew that she was a strong person, with a good mind and a strong sense of who she really was. Marty was aware that she had her flaws. The recent encounter in the bar was a prime example of that. But she also knew what she was good at, and she was good at her business. In fact, she was the best. With a backbone that she had always known she had, but never shown to another living soul, Marty stepped around the final wall panel that separated her from her salesman and his small audience. "Tell me what?" Marty's voice was as cold as steel and her eyes were flaming. The entire group turned, as one, to face Marty. If the subject matter hadn't been so critical, Marty would have laughed at the comical sight of the entire group then turning, as if one again, to face her salesman. But this was no time for laughing. It was obvious that Marty's salesman, Mike Richardson, was trying to decide just how far he should push this and what his next step should be. Apparently realizing that he had just burned his bridges behind him, the slightly intoxicated Mike decided to go for broke. "Tell you, that you are going to ruin this company. You are nothing more than a daddy's girl and this company will fail, because of you. You are so backwards you haven't been out of that mill for ages. Wake up, people like you don't make it in the real world." Silence swept over the group as everyone waited for Marty's response. In the background, the loudspeaker announced that the convention would be breaking for the evening in 20 minutes. Marty decided that it was time for Mike's convention to end right then. Reaching over onto the table, she pressed the makeshift button that rested on each display table. It sent a loud buzzer to the security checkpoint, indicating that assistance was needed. The group looked questioningly at Marty as she stood with her hands on her hips, in silence. As the security guard approached the group, Marty stepped through the few members of the group who separated her from Mike. She calmly reached up and jerked off his convention badge. Speaking over her shoulder in the direction of the officer, Marty said, "This man has just been fired. Please have him escorted off the premises." Mike stood, looking down at the spot on his shirt pocket where his badge had hung moments before. The action had been so calmly and quietly done, it was obvious that he was having trouble grasping what had just taken place. As the security officer took hold of his arm, it all seemed to click. "What the hell," was all that Mike managed to get out before the guard began pulling him toward the door. Realizing that he was being thrown out, Mike managed a few more obscenities, as the pair progressed across the room, but Marty wasn't paying attention to them. Instead, she was looking around the group who had been Mike's audience. With a controlled voice that she hoped conveyed the depth of her boiling anger, Marty said, "Now, I have to tell you, I have never been as angry as I am at this moment. You have each one stood here and stabbed me and our company in the back by allowing that little display to have begun in the first place." Marty continued, "Although this convention is scheduled to go on for 2 more days, our booth will be dismantled tonight and we will be going home tomorrow morning. You will each report to me in my office at 8 o'clock sharp on Thursday morning. If you are not there, your office will be packed up and your personal items will be at the front desk when you do show up. It is wake up and shake up time and you are all on notice as of right now. Get this display taken apart and packed up. I will be back in 30 minutes and I expect this to be taken care of." As quickly as possible, Marty made her way out of the convention hall. Her legs were shaking with the adrenaline rush, combined with the intensity of her emotions at that moment. She knew she had just done something she would be proud of in the days and weeks to come, but at that very moment, she was quite concerned that she was about to throw up. Because of her state of mind, Marty wasn't paying the best of attention when she exited the hall. It was only when she physically ran into a solid body that she realized her path was being blocked. Looking up, Marty found herself face to face with Mike Richardson. The interim few minutes had obviously added fuel to Mike's anger, because he looked as though he were about to explode. Pain suddenly shot through Marty's arms. She realized that Mike's fingers were digging into her flesh. He had grabbed her and was now shaking her. In a voice that was evidently fueled by alcohol and anger, he was screaming at her that she wasn't going to ruin his life, that she would pay for being such an arrogant she. For Marty, Mike's words were not really an issue at the moment. But his shaking her was. Marty had been headed toward the bathroom anyway, and when her current physical state was combined with the unexpected motion Mike was providing, it was inevitable that things were about to come to a rather unexpected resolution. With no way to give Mike any warning, and no real desire to do so anyway, Marty closed her eyes and gave in to her stomach's need to empty itself. There were about 20 people milling around in the hotel lobby, mostly from the hosiery convention. Mike had drawn everyone's attention to them when he had begun screaming at Marty. Several of the men had started toward them in order to separate them, but even they stopped in their tracks as it became apparent what was happening. The entire room watched, in horror, as Marty threw up all over Mike's shirt and pants. Even in his intoxicated state, the situation managed to filter into Mike's brain. He stood staring in disbelief, first at his clothes and then at Marty. Almost in slow motion, he dropped his hands from her arms and stepped back, his face contorted into revulsion at the vomit dripping down the front of his clothes. Somehow, everything had managed to land squarely onto Mike, leaving Marty herself unmarked. As Mike struggled to pull himself together, and say something coherent, his body was suddenly jerked upright from behind. Marty watched, wide-eyed, as the man she had met earlier in the bar, lifted Mike practically into the air by his shirt collar. Spinning on his heel, the bartender half-dragged, half-carried Mike to the doors of the motel. Although what he whispered in Mike's ear shortly before shoving him through the door was too low for anyone else to catch, the intent was obvious to everyone. As the door slammed behind Mike, a general sigh floated through the room. Within moments, conversation started back up, as though nothing unusual had happened. Everyone was moving on with their day, everyone but Marty. Marty was standing, still stunned, in the middle of the room where Mike had stopped her. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Her legs were still shaking, although her stomach had stopped churning. As she tried to figure out exactly what to do next, she found herself being gently pushed toward a soft chair at the corner of the room. Turning her head to see who was doing this, Marty found herself looking into the eyes of a very attractive woman, about her own age. The woman whispered, "Over here, that's right. Just sit down." Then she handed her a wet washcloth. After Marty was seated, the woman gave her a glass of water. "My name is Janice. I am the manager here. It's going to be okay." Marty took a few sips of water and rubbed her forehead with the washcloth. Trying to make a joke, she turned to the woman and said, "Honestly, my dad never mentioned this part of the convention to me." Of course, the woman had no way of knowing anything about Marty's dad, but she chuckled politely anyway. Marty couldn't think of anything else to say, so she simply sat there with the woman as her body calmed down. After a few minutes, Marty took a deep breath and sighed. "Well, I guess I should go see about my booth." At this, the woman clucked her tongue. "I don't think you need to go back in there this evening. The convention is closing up right now. I really believe you should just go up to your room and rest a bit. Why don't you let me send up room service in a bit? Go shower and take it easy." Marty was surprised at the woman's generosity, but her offer was extremely appealing. Quickly pushing aside the voice inside her head that said she shouldn't let a single responsibility slip, Marty decided to take Janice up on her offer. Thanking her, Marty pushed herself up out of the chair and headed for the elevator. Calling after her, Janice promised to send up supper in about 30 minutes. As the doors on the elevator closed, Marty never saw the smile that crossed the manager's face. See, Janice wasn't just the manager. She was also the bartender's sister. And she had seen something during the earlier encounter that no one else had noticed. She had seen the look on her brother's face when he had thrown the offensive salesman out the door, and she knew that look, it was a look of possessiveness. For once in her life, Janice realized that she had something on her big brother. Ty was smitten. After showering and brushing her teeth, Marty was feeling much better. While most people would enjoy the feel of the cotton, she found herself wondering what the thread was that was used. Shaking her head, she resolved to forget about her world for the rest of the evening. There would be time enough tomorrow and for the rest of her life to count needle rows, create thread combinations and design new methods for hosiery production. Tonight was just going to be about her. In the 3 days that she had already been at the motel, Marty had failed to notice any of the amenities that the hotel offered. Not only had she ignored the bathrobe, she hadn't noticed the toiletry items either. In addition to soaps and shampoo, there was also a nail care kit, complete with a soft pink polish. Shrugging her shoulders, Marty decided to go all out. Sticking long pieces of tissue between her toes like she had seen on TV, Marty sat down to paint her toenails. She had barely finished her toes when there was a knock on her door. Realizing that her 30 minutes had passed, Marty wasn't surprised when the person outside the door called out, "Room service." Amused by her own thoughts, Marty opened the door, only to find the bartender from earlier standing in the hall, holding a covered dinner tray. "What are you doing here?" Marty asked in shock. Even in her own dismay, Marty registered that the man looked equally surprised. His voice, which had sounded so incredible earlier in the afternoon, actually cracked a bit as he tried, unsuccessfully, to answer Marty. As she watched his mouth move and heard the sounds that didn't quite make words, Marty cocked her head to the side in confusion. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, rather quickly, "The manager, Janice, that is, asked me to deliver this up to this room." His voice trailed off as he continued to stand in the hallway, looking a bit lost. Marty realized that she was once again staring at the man and shook her head to clear it. Stepping aside, she said, "Please, won't you come in?" "Ty, wasn't it? You can set the tray over there." Marty pointed to a small table in the kitchenette area of the room. As Ty walked past her, Marty realized that she could smell his scent and that she loved it. It wasn't cologne, it was more like a man who had been working hard. Marty assumed that his back was to her since he was walking into her room, so she closed her eyes to savor the experience. When she opened them again, she found that he hadn't walked into her room, instead he was standing very close to her, watching her. Although it only took a matter of seconds to cross the room and reach the table, by the time Marty got there, she felt like she had run a marathon. She wasn't sure what this man did to her, but it was taxing on her system. Pushing aside a few papers, she made a large space for the tray. "Right here. There you go." Hoping to end the strangely arousing encounter, Marty reached out to take the tray from Ty. As she did, her fingers managed to close over his. For the third time that day, Marty found herself staring into the man's eyes. It was only when she heard Ty growl deep in his throat, and he suddenly shoved the tray aside onto the table, that Marty realized that she was in a radically different situation than she had ever been in before. When he turned back to her, he stopped only long enough to look deeply into her eyes for one more moment. Marty felt her heart begin to pound. Ty was going to kiss her. It was a huge understatement to say that, in no way, had her previous experiences prepared Marty for Ty's kiss. When his lips actually claimed hers, Marty thought her heart might burst out of her chest. When Ty suddenly stopped and pulled back on her hand, Marty looked at him in confusion. Ty shook his head and pulled her back close to him. In a husky voice, he said, "My sweet Marty Hampton. Is this what you want?" Marty realized that Ty was trying to make sure she knew what was going on. He said, "I knew I was pushing you too hard. I'm so sorry, baby." Then he pulled her close to him, in a tight hug. Ty? Marty struggled to get coherent words to come out of her mouth. Frowning from the effort it took to concentrate, she said, "Ty. Before we go any further, do you mind telling me your last name?" Ty came to a rather abrupt halt as he looked down into Marty's eyes. "My last name?" he asked, rather blankly. "Well, yes. I was thinking I should at least know that," Marty said, growing concerned that she had somehow offended Ty and he wasn't going to finish what he had started. And Marty was determined that he was going to finish. Shaking his head slightly, as though to clear it, Ty said, "Stewart. My name is Ty Stewart." Marty's face broke into a huge smile. "Glad to meet you, Ty Stewart." Then she giggled. Men like Ty. Marty thought to herself. She had no idea what kind of man Ty was. She didn't even know if he was. "Ty. Are you married?" Marty asked, somewhat panicked. Ty raised his head, a smile played around the corners of his mouth. "No. Are you proposing?" Marty's face flushed bright red before she could even begin to think of an adequate answer. Now this handsome hunk was teasing her. This really was the stuff fantasies were made out of. Too bad it was a fling between passing strangers. Finally, Marty managed to say, "No. I just realized that I didn't know anything about the man who I just had made well, you know." Marty's voice trailed off as she turned her face away slightly in embarrassment. She realized just how inexperienced and childish she must appear. When Marty woke up in the morning, she was alone in the bed. Looking across the room, Marty could see that Ty was standing in the kitchenette area, staring blankly at the wall behind the small microwave. Nearby the coffee maker was steaming and perking, indicating that the early morning drink of choice for Ty must be the dark brew. Marty laughed a bit. Not everyone was as enamored with Coke as she was. Slipping out of bed, she padded across the room to where Ty was. "Ty. Are you okay?" Marty asked, since he hadn't moved at all since she had first spotted him. Ty turned to look at Marty with eyes that held 1,000 different emotions, none of which Marty could grasp. It was as though she were looking into the deep sea, full of life, but none clear to the naked eye. After a moment, Ty shook his head and looked away toward the coffee pot. "I'm making coffee," he said, stating the obvious, somewhat distantly. When he turned back to look at Marty, his eyes no longer revealed his inner thoughts. In fact, nothing about him revealed anything of the man Marty had been with the night before. Except for the fact that he had put the same clothes on that he had worn into her room last night, Marty saw nothing of the man she had given herself to. Shrugging her shoulders slightly, she said, "I'm going to go shower. If you need to go, just lock the door behind you." Then she turned on her heel and headed for the bathroom. With each step that Marty took as she crossed the room, entered the bathroom and closed the door behind her, she prayed that Ty would suddenly bound across the room, grab her and kiss her. But as she turned the lock on the bathroom door, she realized that it was over. When Marty heard the door to her room open, then close, she knew Ty was gone. Bending over her sink, Marty felt the first tears sting the back of her eyes. To be continued.